So tonight is our first class called Positivity Bias. It's stories to reframe our experiences during these turbulent times. Our first lesson, we're going to be speaking about developing a positivity bias. Now, I want to open tonight with a little story, a story that comes from a My Encounter interview with Mr. Charles Roth. He says that during a private audience with the Rebbe, Mr. Charles Roth, he's the executive director of the National Jewish Post for 29 years. And he extolled his periodical. He said, Rebbe, our publication is independent and completely objective. The Rebbe responded, independent perhaps, but objective? There's no such thing as objective. It's humanly impossible to be completely objective. Every person has a bias of some kind. And so tonight I want to start off with some basic questions that I put in your workbook there. Do you agree with this statement of the Rebbe? Do you agree that everyone has a bias? Do you consider yourself as biased in any way? And here's one that I think is very important. The term biased, does it have a negative connotation to you? Does it have a positive connotation to you? Or maybe does it have a neutral connotation to you? And if the idea of bias for you is largely negative, is there ever a situation, is there ever a scenario where it's okay or it's even good to be biased? Let's give an example. Do you think that a parent should be biased when it comes to their child? Is it good or bad for a parent to be biased towards a child? Is it the healthy or the ideal state of a parent to have complete objectivity towards their child, or should they be biased towards their child? I think that what we can understand from the story and the Rebbe's words to Mr. Roth is that while one cannot be or is able to be independent, unbeholden to any particular ideology or organization, you can't live without a bias. So through a mix of nature, nurture, and free will, each of us possess a certain lens that frames and forms the way we see ourselves, the way we see others, and most importantly, the way that we see the world around us. It's not possible for us to be able to erase our personality. We can't erase our past experiences. We can't erase deeply held beliefs, nor do we want to. We can't erase observations, expressions, actions, no matter how hard we try. And the frame that we adopt, whether we adopt that frame consciously or unconsciously, it deeply impacts the way that we perceive reality. The matrix of understanding becomes our operating system, the default mechanism through which we contextualize, through which we react and we interpret every event and every interaction that we experience. So, if our biases inevitably color the way we interpret and experience the world, it follows that the primary focus of life should be to assess and to reset our biases. We have to constantly look at our biases. So based on this, I think we have to ask ourselves tonight the most profound question that we can ask ourselves when it comes to bias. What are my biases? What are they? If I would say that I personally have a bias, what is that bias? And can that bias be adjusted? Can it be changed to better serve myself, to better serve others? Or will our inherent biases be those biases for the rest of our lives, and there's really nothing we can do about it? The premise of this entire course of the next 4 weeks is going to be the Rebbe's positivity bias, meaning that the default lens or the frame through which the Rebbe viewed others and through which the Rebbe viewed the world was fundamentally positive. We are actually a month from the 26th anniversary of the Rebbe's passing. And this course is going to end a few days before the 3rd of Tammuz, which is the anniversary of the Rebbe's passing. So I thought with everything going on in the world, it would actually be a perfect time to attempt to learn to look at the world through the Rebbe's eyes. It's actually based on a book called Positivity Bias by Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson, which I highly suggest that you read. And over the next few weeks, we're going to highlight some of the key teachings, some of the key tools culled from the Rebbe's guidance, which will enable us through dedication and commitment to design our very own positivity bias. Because at the end, if we could leave here both intellectually and emotionally a little more positive and actually create somewhat of a positivity bias for ourselves, I would say that my work here would be complete, and I hope that your work here would also be complete. Now, if you look and analyze the Rebbe, you're going to see that the Rebbe's positivity bias is impossible to miss. There are countless documented stories. There are countless letters and anecdotes and vignettes from the Rebbe's life and behavior that demonstrate how the Rebbe's positivity bias illuminated every single corner of his thoughts and every nuance of his speech and infused his every action, his every reaction, and his every interaction with the power of positive thinking, with the power of positive living. Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson started noticing a pattern in the Rebbe's talks. And this is how this all started. He noticed that the Rebbe would go systematically through many of the passages of the Torah and the Talmud and redeem villainous characters, deviant individuals. The Rebbe would redeem catastrophic events and present them in a positive light. Let's take just one example of this. The story of Korach. It's a story that we're going to read in the Torah portion in a few weeks. A story of the cousin of Moses. He comes and says that Moses doesn't deserve to be the leader, and nor does Aaron. He's considered in classical Jewish literature to be someone who was a megalomaniac. He was egocentric. He was seeking power. He claimed that Moses elevated Aaron, his brother, to the position of influence, and this was a desecration. This was an act of nepotism, and so on and so forth. And there are many, many different interpretations, but the actual words in the Torah were kulam kedoshim. He says every Jew, and by extension every human being as a point of holiness within them. So if every single person has a point of holiness within them, why should there be any hierarchy at all? We should actually live in a world of anarchy. And he was arguing against particularism. And if you will, to put it in contemporary language, he was arguing what John Lennon put in the song, "If you only eliminate those differences between us, we'll all live as one." What the Rebbe manages to say is it's brilliant, it's messianic, that Korach was ahead of his times. He saw something incredible. He wanted to bring about change, but he was too soon. The world wasn't ready for his change. The Rebbe's optimistic and redemptive perspectives on any issues, or what we call the Rebbe's positivity bias, were definitely not reflective of the Rebbe's incredibly challenging life circumstances. He lived through the waves of pogroms, the killing fields of World War I, a typhus epidemic, a refugee crisis, the persecution and forced exile of his father, who he never saw again, the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of communism, World War II, the brutal murder of his brother, his grandmother, and numerous other relatives in the hands of the Nazis, and a life of childlessness. Add to that the fact that the Rebbe personally absorbed and carried the crushing pain of hundreds of thousands of individuals who sought him out for healing, for comfort, for love, for acceptance, for help, and simply sometimes for a reason to live. And what does the Rebbe say once to a Rabbi eunuch? The Rebbe says, I worked on myself to always see things positively. The Rebbe says that each one of us can work to develop our own positive worldview and perspective. Each of us is able to develop a positivity bias. I've always wondered, where does the positivity come from after such darkness? How can an individual live through the most incredible darkness of the world and come out positive? You see, it's interesting that scientifically, bias is synonymous with something negative. We're all conditioned to look at the world through a negative lens. It's just our natural place that we go. Actually, in and of itself, bias just means a predisposition. And each of us have a predisposition. The question is, what is our predisposition and can we change it? So, social scientists talk about negativity bias that we each possess, and that it's part of our DNA, it's part of our genetic composition. And over time, it helped us deal with dangers, it's helped us deal with threats that were lethal, right? Like the tiger is coming to get you, and it's more important to run away from the tiger than to pick your raspberries. The problem is that we've taken thousands of years of that type of conditioning, and now we're applying the same degree of hyper-anxiety to things that are relatively benign, to things that are not lethal, to things that are not dangerous. So, let's say, for example, you have a little dispute with someone and it escalates so quickly and so dramatically because it's tapping into our negativity bias. Or you come home from work, if that ever happens again, and you had 10 encounters with your boss, 9 were positive, the 10th one was negative. Which of the encounters that you had of the day are you going to bring home with you? Of course you're going to bring the negative one. Why? Why are we so conditioned? Why are we so wanting to focus on the negativity in our lives and the negativity around us and the negativity in the world? Why, when we hear that little gossip, that little negative thing, why all of a sudden do our ears perk up and our eyes lift up? We're all excited to hear something. Why is that? The Rebbe says that positivity is a choice. It's not just a matter of circumstance. And it derives from perspective, not just personality. And I would say that the greatest case study of that is the Rebbe himself. So how do we apply this to our lives now? How do we apply this in a very real time, in a very real situation? What happens if we don't all get along? What happens if there are major differences of opinion? So if you're too positive, then you forget to focus on what's important and you overlook the planning of what people call the exit strategy, which the exit strategy is absolutely critical because so many deals break up because the deal didn't incorporate that possible negativity. It may not be the best idea to always be positive. And when it comes to, let's say, interpersonal relationships, it's really a paradox because on the one hand, you want to be very pragmatic. You want to be very concrete. You want and need to get into all the details. Because if you leave things to, I don't know, generalizations, then you end up with many different potential pitfalls in the relationship. So the main currency of interpersonal connectivity is trust. And there's such a dearth and unfortunately a deficit in trust in our society at every single level. So often, trust is critical to how we interpret communication because we're different people. We mean so many different things by the words we use. And we bring to bear a very different life, experiences, values. And so if you come from a position of trust and you see the good and you recognize that people are complex, that people are not monolithic, they're multifaceted, but at the core, every single individual wants to do good. Every individual wants to be good. And you project that into every encounter. The Rebbe believed that if you do that, you will elicit that in the other. You will activate that in the other. And we may not always see that in the short term, but in the long term, it pays off. In the long term, we'll be able to notice a difference in the people that we interact with. Partially also because we're going to change as a result of it. So it's about balance. It's about going there practically and pragmatically. But at the same time, when it comes to interpreting the meaning of the words and the exchange and the social intercourse, the Rebbe would teach that we should always do so with what he called an ayin tov, an eye that's good. Someone once asked the Rebbe if he was happy. And the Rebbe said, always happy, never satisfied. There's always something more to do, which I think is a very different type of bias. It's an action bias. It comes from a place of positivity. And that positivity is, quote unquote, I matter, that everything I do counts. And that if we came from that place, then we would be supercharged with energy and a clarity because every encounter becomes meaningful. I'm going to share with you a beautiful story that I've been living with over the past few years. There was a fellow who wanted to meet the Rebbe. And generally, if you wanted to meet the Rebbe, you had to contact the secretary and you had to set up a meeting, and a meeting may have taken months to get. But he decided to, let's call it, circumvent the protocol. And he sort of ambushed the Rebbe as the Rebbe was walking out of the synagogue, as he was walking out of 770. He was walking to his car, and it was after a very long day at work. And he had to be back in a few hours because he was going to be seeing people through the night, as the Rebbe did often. And this fellow started talking to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe's personal secretary recognized that this was one of those guys who, let's just say, if he wasn't stopped, he would go on forever. And so he gently interjected and said, the Rebbe has to go home. And if you'd like to speak to him further, come see me later. As they get into the car, the Rebbe turns to the secretary and admonishes him gently, but lovingly, but firmly at the same time. It was one of the geniuses of the Rebbe. He was able to admonish lovingly and firmly. And the Rebbe said to him, the holy Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, taught that each of our souls come into this world and spend an entire lifetime just to do one favor for one individual. And the Rebbe turns to his secretary and says, who knows? Maybe my soul came into the world to do this one favor for this one individual right now. What I love about the story is that for the Rebbe, every encounter, every interaction was maybe this is the one. Maybe this is that interaction. So it's a positivity bias that fused every interaction with a sense of reverence, with a sense of awesomeness, with a sense of auspiciousness. And when you live switched on that level, everything changes. Each of us are created with a personality. And sometimes we say, if only I had a different personality. I mean, if only I could delete this piece of my personality. Maybe I could Photoshop it, or today we Canva it. Maybe I can Canva it out. The Rebbe didn't want us to delete it. The Rebbe wanted us to transform it. If you're super ambitious, use that ambition for something holy. If a person is very attached to their self-image, so live up to a very high self-image. There's even a way to channel anger. In the Psalms and the Tehillim, David talks about anger and he says, Ovei Hashem sinu ra. Those who love God or good hate evil. Think about it. Without hate, evil would flourish, according to King David. Without hate, then evil would flourish. You know, at that point of your life where you feel you can't let this go on, and that became the impetus for activism, or that became the impetus for community service, or for whatever it may be, often that comes from anger. Anger means I can't let this go on anymore. It's not anger at someone. It's anger at an idea. And that's the brilliance of the Rebbe, where he disassociates the person from the philosophy. You know, the Rebbe was tremendously positive, but the Rebbe did take on certain ideologies that he felt were harmful for the Jewish community and for society at large. And it's amazing to watch him do it. To see the surgical precision of attacking or perhaps questioning an idea, but loving the individual. There was a certain person from the Chabad community who at some point he had left Hasidic life. He had left what they call the fold. And he became a musician. And he was living in Australia and he was doing a concert there. And the Chabad rabbi asked the Rebbe if he could invite this former Chassid to the school to perform. And the Rebbe responds, what type of values would you like to communicate to the children? Which was the Rebbe's gentle way of saying, absolutely not. The fellow really represented something very different to the Hasidic and to the Jewish values of that community. Now, what's fascinating is, a few months later, this rabbi from Australia ends up in Crown Heights, and he has a meeting with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe asks him in this meeting, how is the Australian musician doing? Now, this Australian rabbi was shocked. He said, what do you mean? Rebbe, you told me to have nothing to do with him. The Rebbe says, I didn't say anything like that. As far as a concert is concerned, that's not appropriate. But on an individual basis, this is an individual who spends time in the community. He's somebody who needs love even more. You should make a point of seeing him and connecting with him. Separating the public persona from the individual. Separating the deed from the essence. Separating the person from the action. One more story like that. There was another person who moved away from Chabad at a certain point. And there was a Chabad rabbi who lived in his town. And the Rebbe once asked this Chabad rabbi that, he had lost formal contact with him for years. And he said, I know this person lives in your town. Now, how is he doing? So the Chabad rabbi was very happy to say, oh, we're great friends. It's wonderful. I see him all the time. He was proud. So the Rebbe says to him, how is he doing in Parnassa? How is his livelihood? Is he making a living? The rabbi says, Rebbe, I don't know. So the Rebbe looks at him and says, and you call yourself a friend? To the Rebbe, friendship means knowing and caring about the details. Once, the Rebbe received a letter from a businessman who, in the course of his travels, had encountered something that really upset him. Specifically, he was perturbed by a man in a far-flung community who would come to the synagogue to make up the minyan, to make up the quorum of 10, but he would not pray. He would just sit there and read his newspaper the entire time throughout the prayers. And he felt that it was a blatant display of disrespect. And it was just more than he could bear. And he writes a letter to the Rebbe complaining. And I put the Rebbe's response in your workbook. The Rebbe responds in a letter dated the 16th of Tammuz, 5720, July 11th, 1960. The Rebbe writes, everyone, of course, reacts to an experience in a way that is closest to him. Thus, for my part, I make the following observations. First, I see in this situation the degree of Jewish attachment that one finds in every Jew. For here is a person who has wandered off to a remote part of the world and has become so far removed, not only geographically, but also mentally, as to have no concept of what prayer is or what a house of God is. Yet one finds in him that Jewish spark. Or as the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, expressed it in his Tanya, the divine soul, which is truly part of God. The divine soul seeks expression as best it can. And in the case of this particular Jew, it seeks expression in at least enabling other Jews to pray congregationally. He therefore goes out of his way to help them and at the same time be counted with them. Think about it for a moment. The Rebbe's insight into the essential goodness of the innermost self reveals that the businessman is not an arrogant heretic. He's not mocking God and Jewish tradition. He's a holy Jew in exile. And he's responding to God's call in whatever way he knows how. That's how we look at someone. I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. It's a story that's recently made its rounds quite a bit. Shirley Chisholm was elected in 1968 to represent New York's 12th congressional district, which included her own neighborhood of Crown Heights. And she actually, what was amazing about it is she makes headlines as the first African-American woman elected to Congress. But soon after her election, she finds her congressional career stunted by race-related politics. Bowing to political pressures from Southern politicians, the House leadership assigned the very urban Chisholm to the Agriculture Committee, a committee that's focused on the need of rural America, a place where they figured the African-American woman can have very little influence. At the time, some of the New York media actually questioned the appointment and expressed doubt as to Chisholm's ability to affect the legislative agenda. I mean, she was committed to take care of issues in the inner city. That's what she knew. But her committee that she was part of did not have the power to do so. And she was depressed and she was angry. But then her office receives a call from the Rebbe's secretary. The Lubavitcher Rebbe wants to see you. She decides to go to the meeting, not sure why this rabbi wants to see her and what she has to do with a rabbi. And during the meeting, the Rebbe told the congresswoman, "I know you're very upset." And she says, "Yes, I'm deeply insulted, Rabbi. What should I do?" And the Rebbe smiles and says, "Mrs. Chisholm, what a blessing God has given you. She's shocked. And the Rebbe continues, "This country has so much surplus food, and there are so many hungry people. You can use this gift that God gave you, your current position, to feed hungry people. Find a creative way to do it." She leaves this meeting tasked with a charge. She happens to meet Senator Bob Dole, her first day in Washington. And he was looking to help Midwestern farmers who were losing money on their crops because Americans were starting to import produce. And the senator told her that as a result of those imports, our farmers are losing business. And we have a huge surplus of unsold food, and we don't know what to do with it. There it was. Chisholm thought, my gosh, the rabbi's advice. During the next few years, she worked to expand the National Food Stamp Program, which had allowed poor Americans to buy subsidized food from Midwestern farmers. And finally, in 1973, the Agriculture and Consumer Protection Act mandated that food stamps be made available in every jurisdiction in the United States. She and Senator Dole went on to co-create the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children, which today is called the WIC, and today benefits millions of people each month. At her retirement party, there was a man by the name of Dr. David Lukens. He was there, and he told the following story that he heard from her. he says she got up at her retirement party and she shared the following moving words. She said, I owe all of this to a rabbi who was an optimist, who taught me that what you may think is a challenge is actually a gift from God. And she continued, if poor babies have milk and poor children have food today, it's because this rabbi in Crown Heights had vision. On Shmini Atzeret in 1977, the Rebbe suffered a serious heart attack. And 2 days later, he wanted to give a talk. He always gave a talk. For 28 years, he had given a talk on that day, and he wanted to give a talk. And the doctors didn't want him to give that talk, and they said, Rebbe, you must take care of your health. If not, there's a 25% chance of relapse. And the doctor says, Rebbe, do you understand what I'm saying? So the Rebbe smiles and he says, you said if I don't take care of my health, which I assure you I will, there's a 75% chance that there won't be a relapse. The Rebbe's positive paraphrasing of life might seem radical to some, but it's a necessary perspective for all of us today. We have to be able to engage in this positive paraphrasing. If we can just apply a little bit of this optimism to our lives, problems would be relieved. All of the issues would be revealed as potentials for growth. Enemies would be understood as teachers. Setbacks would be seen for what they really are. They're just springboards to the next level. Scientists have coined the term negativity bias to describe a common human phenomenon. Essentially, our ingrained negativity bias ensures that experiences of a more negative nature have a greater effect on our psychological state and consequent behavior than neutral or positive ones, even when they are of equal intensity. If you have a positive experience or a negative experience, the negative experience is going to take over your life. And according to these neuroscientists, our brains have developed specialized circuits that register negative experiences immediately into our emotional memory so that we can learn from them. On the other hand, most positive experiences flow through the brain like water through a sieve. We experience them, we enjoy them, and unless we took pictures, we quickly forget them. And so we have to use much more brain space to scan and to process negative experiences than positive ones. Because negative stimuli, if not registered, and if it's not responded to appropriately, can be fatal. So out of necessity, we've become masters of fixating on negative aspects of our lives, of negative aspects of our environments. We have no choice. That's the way we've become. It's only natural. Think, if you have 9 positive experiences or interactions during the day and 1 negative one, where are you going to dwell? What's going to happen? One little thing can ruin your day. How could that negative experience ruin your day? What did it do? It's such a great day. Everything was going so wonderful. And one little thing, boom, the whole day is finished. You see, the problem is that negativity bias has a side effect. Since we're always on high alert for potential dangers, the positive aspects of our lives tend to get less attention. And when we receive a compliment, for instance, we feel nice, we feel all lovey inside for a moment. But what happens after that moment? The brain shifts back to the defensive mode. and we forget about all those nice warm feelings. So we may walk around in a low-level state of hypervigilance and anxiety. And as a result, we blow our negative experiences out of proportion, and we're not able to contextualize them within the positive aspects of our life. We've forgotten in moments of stress. Establishing a positive mindset is difficult. We're asking ourselves to do something that's not natural. It goes against the grain of our established nature. And maintaining a positive perspective in the midst of hardship is the only way that we can elevate our quality of life. You can have when everything is hunky-dory, when everything is wonderful, it's easy to have a positive experience. But what about today? What about when everything is tough? When you just want to curl up and stay in bed and there's no reason to get out because nobody wants you out of your house anyway. What about today? That's when we have to be positive. I'll tell you a little fun fact. According to recent findings, people who have a more positive and optimistic lens on life will live 11 to 15% longer than their pessimistic peers. I think the Rebbe was well aware of this. He was well aware of the natural tendency of human consciousness to dwell on the negative. And nevertheless, the Rebbe insisted constantly that we should change our experience of life for the better, to make conscious and concerted efforts to focus and to dwell in the positive. Someone who used to complain to the Rebbe often about his life circumstances once received this powerful response, and I put it here in your book. The Rebbe wrote him, I'll just read it. In our world, everything is a mixture of good and bad. Human beings must choose which aspects they're going to emphasize, contemplate, and pursue. How instructive is that which our sages tell us that Adam was an ingrate. Even before he was banished from the Garden of Eden, while living in a literal paradise, he complained about his circumstances. Sound familiar? On the other hand, there were Jewish men and women who thanked and blessed the Creator and recited the morning blessings even while living through the most horrifying times in the German concentration camps. Ultimately, everyone's circumstances will be somewhere between these extremes. My point in saying this, the Rebbe says, is not to admonish you. It's simply to underscore the reality that the type of lives that we live, whether full of satisfaction and meaning or the opposite, depends in a large measure on our willpower, which dictates whether we will focus on the positive or on the negative. Our perspectives are so powerful, they can lead us to find fault with paradise or to express gratitude even while in a state of extreme suffering. In a rare personal disclosure to one of his aides, the Rebbe once said, I worked on myself to always look at things in a positive light. Otherwise, I could not have survived. So at that moment in the protest, at that moment during COVID, when nothing is positive, when you can't find the positive in anything, when you really want something and then you don't get it, when you have a true sense of loss on much deeper levels, you lose a friend, you lose a family member, God forbid. In that whole range of human experiences, when you really suffer a loss, What does the Rebbe say about that? What is the Rebbe's approach? How do you find the positive in the most negative of circumstances? What did the Rebbe say? Take the grief and channel it into something holy and constructive. And the Rebbe did this himself. I'll tell you, after the Rebbe's wife passed away, it was clear to everyone that the Rebbe was deeply, deeply hurt by the passing of his wife. And almost immediately after her passing, the Rebbe launched a campaign of growth and productivity and creativity. Any occasion where the Rebbe lost someone, or the Rebbe lost something, or the world had lost something, the Rebbe took that collective pain and suffering as an opportunity to launch a campaign for the betterment of the world. For example, after the Rebbetzin passed away, after the Rebbe's wife passed away, the Rebbe launched the birthday campaign. The Rebbe encouraged all the Hasidim and communities beyond to mark a birthday with a spiritual gathering. The Rebbe said people should have family and friends there and do acts of goodness and kindness and make charity resolutions. Now, you have to appreciate that for the longest time and traditionally, Jewish people did not place a great emphasis on birthdays. Rather, most Jewish people placed an emphasis on yahrzeits, because the yahrzeit, the day of a passing of a loved one, allows us to evaluate the lifetime in its entirety. But a birthday, you're still in the middle of the game. It's like you're running a lap, you're in the Olympics, and you're at round 3, and you sit down and you pull out a bottle because we're doing so well. When you finish the race, we'll see how quickly you came in. But the Rebbe changed that. The Rebbe taught that a birthday is a day of potential. It celebrates why we're here. So birth, the Rebbe would say, is God's way of saying you matter. That the birthday celebrates the mission that we came into this world to do. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, he would say that the day you were born is God's way of saying that the world couldn't exist without you. And that's what a birthday is. The Rebbe would say to us, make a shechianu, a special blessing on a new fruit, and make the special blessing on the day itself. It's an incredible thing. It means we're here and we have something to do on this earth. The Rebbe took the most painful experience. And if you see this period, you can see his wife's passing deeply impacted him. The Rebbe took death and tragedy and turned it into growth. The Rebbe would always say action. Go out and do what you can. Go out and march. Go out and protest if that's the way the Jewish community is organizing itself. If that's what's happening. Go out and write op-eds. The Rebbe wanted us to make a difference, to go out. Don't just stay. If you are deeply bothered, if you're angry about what happened, if you saw the video and it deeply moved you, don't not respond to that emotion. Go on Facebook and write it. Tell the world about it. It doesn't matter if people have a different feeling than you do. If you're deeply moved, if you're angry about something, don't bottle it up. Use it to inspire people. Use that energy to be able to make a difference in the world. Go out and spread goodness and kindness. Go out and fight senseless acts of evil with senseless acts of goodness. That was the Rebbe's view. That was the Rebbe's mission. Senseless acts of evil with senseless acts of goodness. Senseless is the key word here, because terrorism and hatred in this universe today has reached the furvish levels of senselessness. There's no exchange. There's no give or take. It's not transactional. The good that we do sometimes is very calculated. So rise above calculation, do an act, a random act of goodness and kindness, and that's going to tip the scale. It's senselessness. Respond with the same senselessness. It's so interesting because so much of the activism today is based on fighting a negative. It's based on fighting injustice. It seems to really, it motivates, it rouses this generation. And at some point, if all you do is this kind of sort of like fight the negatives and you're just fighting the injustice, it ends up influencing your soul, because all we're doing all day is just fighting the negative. Why? I was wondering, the ultimate optimist, the Rebbe with the positivity bias, what would the Rebbe say right now, today? Monday night, June 1st, 2020, with a pandemic going on in the world, with majority of the cities in the United States are right now, as we speak, on curfew, lockdown, because of riots. We're seeing images coming out of these places that we haven't seen in years. Riots across the United States to this level we haven't seen in years. What would the Rebbe say to these people? And I was looking today. I was trying to find the Rebbe's optimistic view on this, the positivity bias in this. And I looked at the way the Rebbe viewed the youth of the 60s and 70s. And I think this could be extended to millennials and to what's going on right now. You know, there's been a lot of people beating up on the millennials. They say they have no sense of loyalty. They say they have no sense of commitment. I was having a conversation with my wife, and she said something quite brilliant. She asked, where is this non-committal, this non-loyalty coming from? It's coming from a place where these people want to impact. They want meaning. They want to see that they're doing something good, and they're willing to sacrifice the comfort of a secure job to do so. That's genius. That's a positivity bias. And it's true. They're willing to work. They're willing to move into different jobs much more quickly and readily than generations before, which the generations before, they just looked for security. All they wanted was financial security, the security of the paycheck. Here, we have a generation of people that want to know they're making a difference, and that's brilliant. And you know what the Rebbe said to the people of the 60s and 70s, to the people who wanted to make a difference? Go out and make a difference. Change that. Find your positivity in that. It shouldn't lead you to riot and loot. It should lead you to standing up for what's right, for standing up for justice. The Rebbe said that we need to change human rights into human responsibilities. We don't have innate rights. We have responsibilities. Each and every one of us has a responsibility, a unique responsibility to make this world a better place. Now, if someone else had the same responsibility with us, then we wouldn't be here. Which means that no one that came into this world before us, no one that will come into this world after us, and no one that is here during our lifetime has the same unique purpose as we do. So if you are motivated, if you are angry, if you're frustrated, channel that. Take that anger, take that frustration, and do something good. Make a difference. Reach out. The world needs this change. We have to stop just focusing on the negativity and the negativity. It's too much. It's too much. The world needs this change. And the only people that are going to be able to do it is us, because that's what we're focused on. We came here tonight. I listened to so many of you tonight, and what I heard is an anger. I don't want it to be like this. I'm frustrated. Well, you can bottle up that frustration, or you can channel that frustration to something positive. And that's what the Rebbe is saying. So I want to summarize the 5 main ideas that I spoke about tonight. And I wrote that in your workbook. Number 1, that each of us has a subjective and biased way of viewing ourselves, of viewing others and the world around us, which is only natural. Number 2, our personal bias colors our perception and experience of the world, and hence, from a strategic point of view, rather than trying to deal with the symptoms and the effects of our biases, we should try to assess and reset our biases themselves. Number 3, naturally, we each possess a negativity bias, which makes developing a positive default prism on life more challenging, but also necessary. Number 4, negativity bias diminishes our quality of life, and therefore we need to counter it with a more balanced and more positive perspective. And number 5, living a life of positivity is a matter of choice, not circumstance, and derives from perspective, not personality. Developing a positive bias is therefore within the capacity of each of us. And that is what we're going to start talking about in the coming weeks, is how we are going to be able to develop this positivity bias.